So here we are for State of the Nation, what we are managing right now and what we can maybe let go. The word unprecedented has never had such weight. We have in the past few weeks dramatically changed the way we work, the way we communicate, and the way we sell. As one marketer pointed out, it's the confluence of everything at once. The speed of change, the hit to the supply chain, the emotional, social, and financial pressures that make this such a challenge. And yet, I think we can all agree that we are seeing from marketers, publicists, and event organizers profoundly dynamic, exciting, and inspiring work in response. So I'm hoping that this session can be part commiseration, part collaboration, and part celebration, because even in a short time, this particular corner of publishing has just proven itself to be earth-shatteringly brilliant. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by three such brilliant humans: Polly Osborn, Marketing and Publicity Director at Simon & Schuster, Anna Frame, Publicity and Director at Canongate, and Laura Giuseppe, Freelance Publishing and Marketing Consultant. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read out their full bios, but you can find them all on the website where you registered. So we're going to get started. It's worth saying at the outset that this conversation is intended as an overview. Our panelists are going to be as specific and practical as they can, but we'll be touching on a lot of topics as opposed to diving deep today. Where your feedback will be massively helpful is in telling us once we're done where you would like to see topics covered in more detail, and that is what will inform our upcoming events. So, my first set of questions are for the whole panel. This is a period of inconceivable challenge and change, and simultaneously a period of incredible creativity and collaboration, and I want us to discuss both. So we're going to start with some shout outs. Can you each give me one quick example of an initiative, a campaign pivot, or a collaboration within the industry that has impressed you in the past few weeks? Let's start with you, Polly.
I have to give a shout out to Orion and their incredible non-fiction editorial teams who have been pulling it out of the bag in seemingly no time at all to publish some really relevant titles over the next couple of weeks. Obviously, particularly the Adam K is amazing, getting all those contributors together in such a short time, and then you know, having the retailer partnerships linked up. So it all goes out in one go was really, really impressive in a really short space of time. So I tip my hat to them.
Thanks, Polly. Anna, how about you?
I want to give a shout out to the independent booksellers around the UK. I think they're doing an extraordinary job. And in particular, I want to mention 4 bookshops, Forum, Linga, Booker, and Bookish Crick, who've put together a series of online events using Facebook Live under the moniker of At Home with 4 Indies, which they're also using to then reach out to other independent bookshops around the UK. And they did that at a point when they weren't even sure whether they could actually get stock out to sell the books themselves. And I also just want to mention Lighthouse Books in Edinburgh, which is one of my locals here, who I thought did an amazing job of dealing with the stock issues of the fact that they could only really sell the books in their shop at the time by putting together a lucky dip for, you know, kind of a themed lucky dip around politics or feminism or literature. And I thought it was a really clever, really smart solution to a difficult problem.
Thanks, Anna. How about you, Laura?
I'd like to give a shout out to the London Writers Salon. They are a writers network and they were mainly focused on live events. But since the beginning of lockdown, they started a daily writing session from 8 to 9 a.m. They all tune in on Zoom. All they do is having writers tuning in, having tea together, and then everyone start writing. It's a moment of sort of accountability, and they all sort of connect. And in a stressful time like this, having that sense of community really allowed them to connect with writers and offer like a fantastic opportunity for them to just tune in and write together.
Brilliant. Thank you all. So we're now going to ride that wave of positivity into the next question, where we talk about the challenges that we're facing right now. So Anna, if we can start with you from a Canongate perspective and from an indie perspective, what are your biggest challenges right now?
I mean, I think the challenge, I think, for us are probably the same as a lot of people in the industry. It's just that kind of dealing with the uncertainty that's happening at the moment, the fact that things are changing so fast that we don't know day to day what the situation is going to be like the following day, the following week, the following month, how long this is going to go on for. And I think, you know, not just kind of working out the best ways to publish effectively in the face of that, but also keeping motivated and keeping your spirits up in that, I think can be a really tough challenge. I think it's something that, as I say, we're all really trying to work with at the moment.
Absolutely. Polly, do you want to follow on?
I'd say, yeah, that unpredictability on 2 factors. Firstly, from all the pub dates moving, I think that it created this kind of mass firefighting project for marketeers and publicists across the country, and it's still going on as things develop. And combined with that, the retailer landscape, so not knowing if things are going to be in stock, not knowing which retailers are going to be kind of open from week to week. I think it being so unpredictable, and specifically those two factors, I think really make life difficult for marketing and publicity.
Thanks, Polly. Laura, what are you seeing from a freelance perspective as challenging right now?
I think the online space is becoming increasingly saturated. We're all offering online festivals, virtual book launches, and I think, finding a unique selling point when so many different brands are doing very, very similar initiatives is going to be a massive challenge. And I know we're going to touch this on this later, but monetization is going to be massive issues as well, when now we're all providing free content for obvious reasons.
Absolutely, yes, and we will get to that down the line. So let's start to get practical with this. Laura, I'm going to come straight back to you in terms of what steps you're taking for yourself in order to keep a sense of structure, in order to keep a handle on mental health, in order to stay motivated. Now, you obviously moved from HarperCollins to freelance a couple of years ago, so some of these things are not quite so dramatic. So if there's anything you can share that's helpful that you've learned over that time, that would be great.
Yes, I went freelance 2 years ago after 15 years working in-house, and I couldn't wait 2 years ago to go from a very, very structured environment to a life with no structure. Little did I know how important structure is when you go freelance. And for me, structure was having different environments for different activities. So I had my days for university teaching, my days working at co-working space, my days working from home. And I think that gave me a very clear structure. So different environments were places for different activities. Now the challenge is that one environment is going to be an environment for everything. So, say your living room is going to become your yoga studio, and then your setting for an online talk, or your activity to your space to connect with colleagues. So I think to have a structure, a calendar, and having micro tasks is really, really important. So I think what I tend to do is having a structure every day where I sort of upload in everything, also my sort of activities where I do yoga, I do a workout, and that becomes part of my day. And I think in particular at a time like this where mental health is so important, having micro tasks and then working on, say, 90-minute activities is much more fulfilling, and you feel that you sort of completed something. So having a very clear structure when you have just one environment that has to serve like every purpose, really.
That's great. Thank you. Anna, how about you? What have you instituted for yourself and your team to help get through this? And how are you keeping yourself and your team motivated?
It's a really interesting one, because obviously Canongate is one of the few companies that's based across 2 cities. So we're partly based in London, partly based in Edinburgh. About 2/3 of our staff are up here where I am. So we had some experience already of the challenges and the advantages of having teams working remotely. And I think that maybe put us at a slight advantage in the fact that we already had things like Slack set up, which has proven invaluable for us over the last few years. And particularly, I think when everyone's now been working from home, obviously now it's a completely different scale. We're used to having those open plan offices, where you can chat to your colleagues face to face. And I think one of the most important things I've discovered, both from my experience over the last few years with Canongate, and also over the last few weeks with everyone working from home, is just that real importance of the informality of the socializing side of things. One of the reasons why Slack was so helpful to us when we first started using it was it allowed us a place to chat basically between the 2 offices in the way that you might do in one room. So we have a channel that is entirely dedicated to dog photographs, and to general conversation. And it sounds ridiculous, but it makes a difference, because I think you miss that otherwise. And so I think now we're all working from home. We try and check in the morning, like say good morning, say hello. When all of this first started, my team ran tours of their working environment for their colleagues, which I think really helped, because it not only gave you a visual and gave you a sense of where everyone was, but also highlighted some of the potential challenges that, whether it's children or pets or noisy neighbors that they might be dealing with. We've replaced our more structured sales and campaigns meeting that we have weekly with a coffee morning once a week, where again, there's space to talk about campaign problems, but also, again, that kind of more informal chat. And I think also just celebrating the good things. You know, it is hard, I think, when you're on your own. You can feel very, very lonely. And I think everyone's sort of so focused on trying to work out where we're going next that you can skip over the celebrations. We had a top 10 bestseller last week with Nick Cave, which was wonderful. We were so excited, and it was a really nice thing that we all checked in, the entire company basically checked in on Zoom and raised a glass to him, and you know, we got him on the phone to say congratulations. And I think those things are just more important now than ever.
Absolutely agreed. Thank you. Polly, can you answer this one for yourself and also speak a bit about doing this with 2 small children at home?
Yes. So I think it's a very unique challenge, should I put it like that, for those with small children who don't have kind of childcare in place for the time being. I think the main thing from my perspective is realizing that every single person is dealing with their own variety of problems associated and challenges associated with the current working situation. So parents don't have a monopoly on a difficult life at the moment, but their challenges are specifically tricky, I think, particularly when it comes to the process of making yourself feel professional in this environment, which is quite tricky. I bought a shed. That was the answer for me, which I can kind of resort to when I need to get away from people. But I think the main thing as a manager is to encourage even more flexibility around the working day for the individuals, that in a way that works for them. So being kind of understanding that there are going to be times when people are going to be away from their desk. There are going to be times that it makes more sense for somebody to work really early in the morning or late in the evening, whatever it is, and just being very, very flexible with that. And the joy of working from home is that that doesn't matter. The main thing as well is, I think, for the parents to not beat themselves up, get Disney Plus. You know, there are things that we can do that are short-lived, you know, fixes for everybody. And I think just kind of be patient with yourselves and just really try not to beat yourself up.
Yes, that has to be the mantra. I'm going to turn away from that towards the quick discussion of furloughs for Polly and Anna. The majority of publishers have furloughed a percentage of staff, which, while necessary, presents both a morale challenge and a workload challenge for marketers and publicists across the industry. I want to start by asking Polly for your thoughts on this. Simon & Schuster have not furloughed staff at this time. So as someone who sits slightly outside this, what are the major concerns that you see for teams with members on furlough, both for now and when the entire team resumes work?
I think that it's a really challenging scenario. As you said, S&S at the moment haven't furloughed anybody, but that's not necessarily to rule it out in the future. Obviously, we don't know how long this is going to go on for. And I think the real challenge is going to come in the autumn, if I'm really honest. I think the challenge is going to come in the autumn because a lot of people have moved books out of the next month or so. August, September and October looking much more congested than they were before. And that's going to be the point at which hopefully the furloughed staff end up coming back into the business. And I think if I was an MD, a CEO of a company that was furloughing their marketing and publicists, I would be really realistic about what they can achieve when it comes to the autumn, because I think there are going to be a lot of people under a huge amount of pressure as soon as they come back. And in the meantime, there are a whole load of staff who are perhaps taking on additional work whilst other members of their team are on furlough. So being patient and realistic with those people in the short term, but trying to look ahead to the autumn and think about their staff then and how they're going to cope, because I think it's going to be tough on marketers and publicists come September and October, and also the pressure then to make those book sales back and to make budgets in those months is going to be immense. So I think we're going to have to look after marketers and publicists in the autumn.
Yes, we are. Anna, can you bring in your perspective here? What do you see as the major concerns, and what do you recommend in terms of keeping up morale right now?
I mean, it's an interesting one. Canongate has furloughed some staff. Actually, most of the publicists are still working, but we're making sure that everything kind of stays very, very flexible. You know, the minimum you can furlough someone for is 3 weeks, but that's not to say that after those 3 weeks, we might not do a bit of kind of mix and match, or, you know, switching people back in or out. That's also obviously come alongside a whole lot of other measures we've put in place in terms of senior management taking pay cuts and, moving books around. And I think, we wouldn't be doing any of this if it wasn't necessary. This isn't a landscape that any of us really want to be publishing into. But, we're doing it because it is necessary and because it feels like the right thing to do. I think, Polly, you're completely right when you're saying that the key is to look after staff. And certainly the decision-making that we were making at Canongate in terms of who was furloughed was very much in collaboration with staff. So wherever possible, people who actively wanted to be furloughed for reasons of childcare or something like that were furloughed, and equally people who actually didn't want to weren't. But I think the key, as I say, is just to kind of make sure that those people who are left behind are being taken care of. I'm really encouraging my team to still take their holidays, take their days off. It feels ridiculous in some ways when you're you can't really go out for more than a couple of hours a day to try and take holiday. But actually, we closed for the Easter break. We closed on the Friday and Monday around Easter. And I came back to work on Tuesday feeling genuinely much more refreshed than I had done on the Thursday. I think that risk of burnout is very, very real. But yeah, I think it is just a question of, sort of touching on what you were saying before, Polly, about being communicative with your team, making sure that you're being flexible with them, understanding where the different pressures lie and trying to take that into account as much as possible while also looking after the business.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to press and events because these were overwhelmingly the topics of greatest concern amongst those of you who registered today. Polly, can you start by telling us what you're finding is happening with press coverage? And can you share any tips for what's working right now in terms of breaking through with journalists, bloggers, and influencers?
Sure. So first things first, in terms of what we know about, say, take newspapers at the moment. So newspapers' physical sales overall are down, but their digital viewings are massively up. Guardian, for example, on the 17th of March had 24 million unique viewers, which is the highest single day on the Guardian that it's ever had over Brexit, Trump, all of those things. So people are obviously kind of really both desperate. I imagine that most people are doing what I do. They're reading the news like this. They sort of have to look at it, but don't really want to look at it. I think the journalists are dealing with that space really. It's a really difficult one to negotiate, because at the moment, what we're finding is that features people are not really super open to anything which doesn't have a certain degree of heft to it. So the kind of lighter end of the features is quite difficult to get into, because I think the features editors are steering away from kind of anything too whimsical, anything too kind of just light and fun. So I think if you have anything which is emotional and weighty and has gravitas and is relevant to the stories at the moment, then I think that is quite, that's going to get slightly more cut through. I think we are all fans of experts now, so I would definitely encourage people who have experts on their list to kind of get them coming to the fore. Overall, I would say the main thing in terms of the press more broadly is trying to keep those journalists informed about the pub date moves and doing everything you can to make it as clear as possible for them in terms of what's moving where. So we've just created, for example, for our social media channels, a block which says May books, June books, July books with the book jackets on. So everybody can just see, here's what's coming really, really clearly.
Great. Thank you, Polly. That's really good, tangible, practical tips. Anna, how about you? What can you share with us?
Yeah, I'm finding it's really interesting, because I'm finding that there seems to be a bit of a split between the papers and magazines, where some of them are absolutely crying out for features, because there is no sports news at the moment, particularly. There's nothing really in terms of, going out and things like that, and the news is very much focused on coronavirus. And so that offers, I think, a really interesting opportunity for books coverage, which we might not otherwise normally have. I think Polly's right in the fact that heftier, kind of weightier topics seem to be getting more traction. I think also on that slightly lighter end of the scale, the kind of more practical hobby side of things, we're getting a lot about indoor gardening and about cooking and about, those side of things, I think seem to be getting more pickup as well. There's also a possible risk. I'm finding some magazines are holding off on commissioning outside writers because they're worried about their drop in sales as well. Magazines are obviously massively down in terms of sales. And so they're looking at their budgets and questioning whether they can really justify paying an external person to write something if they can get a staffer to do it. And that's obviously not a challenge for us as well. I think the key thing from my perspective is, I think, probably just being patient, understanding that journalists are dealing with exactly the same things that we are in terms of not knowing day to day what's happening, not knowing what's possible, not, being told 1 minute that they want coronavirus related stories and 1 minute being told they want anything but that. that journalists are working with exactly the same challenges as many of us in terms of their home setups, that they're trying to deal with, juggling work and childcare and, everything else at the same time. And I think Polly's point again about being really clear about changing publication dates is absolutely spot on. We're sending out a weekly email now that has a list of all of our titles for the next kind of 6 months or so, with all the formats, the genres they fall into, and then press releases for the most immediately upcoming titles. And that's going out to basically our entire database every week, with the publicist copied in. And it just means that there's a bit more clarity in what our list is doing, because our list is still changing as well. And it just means that we are being as clear and as communicative as possible with the journalists we're working with.
And Anna, I'm going to stay with you there for a second to follow on, just to talk about proofs really quickly, which is a pretty interesting area, as it was problematic before the crisis. And I think a lot of people are wondering if this is going to dramatically shift proof strategy for the future. Are you still sending them? And for those of our audience who aren't, what, if anything, is effective in making sure people are getting and reading PDFs?
So before we left the office, we sent a whole load of proofs, so about kind of 5 or 6 boxes, I think, possibly more, to Parallel, who have been our absolute godsend over the last few weeks. I'm sure they have been for many publicists. I'm finding we're increasingly now having to do things digitally, because we now don't have access to the office in the way that we did even just sort of a few weeks ago. We're lucky that most of our staff can walk into the office. So even up until a couple of weeks ago, we were walking in and still sending things out. We've pretty much now stopped that. We're sending out NetGalley links. Obviously, NetGalley is a joyous thing. We're sending out PDFs. I do think it's definitely challenging, I think, to try and get that same level of traction. There are a lot of journalists who just naturally don't really like reading on screen, which I completely empathize with. So I think in terms of trying to encourage that, again, there's the idea of being very, very clear in your pitches more than ever before, being very, very precise, very thoughtful in your pitches. And I think wherever possible, pointing people towards specific areas of that PDF. If you're offering serial, if you're offering interview, if you're offering something specific, point them towards page numbers, so that rather than, expecting them to riffle through a book, which they now suddenly don't have physically, they can go straight to a section that you think is relevant and best for them. But Right. It is a big challenge, I think.
Polly, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think the hope that everybody has at the moment is that more people will be open to reading digitally when this is over. I think we're in a unique circumstance at the moment because there are less books publishing in the next couple of months. So we might be getting greater cut through on supplying digital versions to journalists at the moment than we would otherwise. I think it's going to be different when we're back. And I think that's going to be an interesting point to see whether or not people stick with it. I would say at the moment, because the situation forces it, it's a nice experiment for people, and I would love to get to a position where we were taking less of the kind of proof blanket bomb approach, but I don't know how long it's gonna stick for.
Okay, great. Just to say to everyone, if you're only just joining us, do submit your questions for our panelists via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering as many as possible at the end of the session. We're going to turn to events now. We're going to start over with Laura. Laura, in your role at the Shoreditch co-writing space, Clean Prose, you've gone from having a beautiful physical event space as your USP to needing to move all your events online quite rapidly. What do you think makes for a good digital event? And can you give us a couple of quick tips for moving events online?
Yes, absolutely. As you mentioned, we went from having a beautiful space that actually launched in October. We're very excited because, of course, it was the first co-working space for writers in London. We knew that the model existed in New York and Los Angeles, so we knew that the model was going to be successful in the UK. We set it to have a number of members, and then, of course, we had to close. So we had a community that we still wanted to serve, so we set it to set up a series of Clean Prose talks that were online talks, half-an-hour talks with agents, authors, editors, to provide that support. Now, we went from having a very clear, unique selling point, which was the space and a co-working space for writers, which is exactly, sort of allocating to a niche audience, to having to basically create talks in a very, very saturated environment. So it was really important to have something that had a very clear structure and a model that could work. we immediately found that Zoom was creating a closed environment, so it was performing better than Facebook Live and Instagram Live, just simply because it creates that moment of sort of accountability, and you're there. And what we found was that we were starting with, say, 88 people at the beginning, and we're ending with 88 people at the end. So Zoom creates this sort of platform that feels a bit more like a closed environment, rather than sort of the quick in and out you might do on a Facebook Live or Instagram Live. In terms of sort of practical tips, asking questions online on your social channels in the lead up to the event has worked quite well. So if we had an event with an agent, we'd ask people for like the questions they would like to ask, and then those questions were asked during the talk. So asking questions in the lead up to the event, having a very clear timeline with the publisher. So, you know, when we're promoting the event on Eventbrite, then making sure that the publishers were also promoting it across their channels, and also having to make sure that there was also a link to book if we had an author, having a discount code for a book if we were working with independent bookstores, or with Amazon Prime if we're working with Amazon. So yes.
That's great. Thank you. Anna, you're just about to embark on a virtual events tour for Robert Webb's new book, which publishes this week. So, so many virtual events have cropped up in such a short space. Can you say a bit how you curated this particular tour?
Yeah, sure. So it was kind of heartbreaking, to be honest, because we'd put together a tour of 17 events around the UK for audiences of between 350 to 1,000 people for Rob. 7 of those events were in collaboration with Fane. 10 of them were with a mixture of independent bookshops, Watersons, literary festivals, things like that. And obviously, you know, Rob's book publishes this week. We were meant to be out on tour this week, and it feels pretty heartbreaking, I think, that we're not out promoting the book in that way, especially given it's, you know, such a kind of major source of sales for a book like his. But that being said, you know, as soon as we worked out that the tour was not going to go ahead, I was really keen to try and put together some form of online tour for him and for his novel, because I know how good he is, I know how entertaining he is, and how well he sells his book when he talks about it. And I was really keen that the virtual tour reflected the same variety that the physical tour did. So we were already talking to Will Rycroft at Watersons about the possibility of doing a filmed interview with Rob. And so that kind of felt like a fairly natural and fairly easy shift over to an Instagram Live with the Watersons account. Simon Savage, who's been a big supporter of Rob since How Not to Be a Boy, was also meant to be cheering him at the Bath Festival. And so again, we decided to do an Instagram Live with Simon, who was very supportive and very excited. So we're doing that as a kind of mini launch on Thursday. I started talking very early to Helen at Forum Books, who was one of the bookshops I mentioned earlier for the At Home with 4 Indies. So Rob was one of their launch events. That's going to be over at Facebook Live, where he's giving a talk rather than a shared event. And then, of course, there are this really interesting mix of online book clubs and festivals that are springing up all over the place. And I think in the same way that I would with any kind of physical event, I just sort of took each case, you know, each event on a case-by-case study and worked out whether I think they're going to be effective, whether I think they're going to bring an audience in, what their own platforms are, and who I think they're going to reach. And I've been very clear with Rob and very honest with him and his team that it's a bit of an experiment. I mean, of course it is. You know, some of the events are free, some of them are paid for, some of them you have to buy a book to get access. You know, some of them you just have to click on a link. And it's going to be really interesting to see, I think, how that conversion to sales works, if it does. My hope is that because we are in these very, very strange circumstances where we are experimenting, we have this space to experiment in a way that we really don't have a choice but to experiment, it might lead us to some interesting solutions to working out what's effective and what's not, and that actually in the future we might be able to have more virtual events in some form or other. I think accessibility has been a massive issue with book events in the past, you know, for people who are potentially, you know, caught at home or who can't make it out to a book festival. And I think we have an amazing opportunity here, and I think it's really exciting.
Absolutely. And that segues really nicely into what we mentioned briefly earlier, this question about the sort of long-term sustainability of the event models that we're seeing right now. There are a lot of events that are being run for free. There are a lot of events without the link to the book. Laura, from an event organizer standpoint, from somebody who will ultimately need revenue from their events, what do you think we should be thinking about here?
I think what like our standpoint has been that half-an-hour talks are free. So with Clean Prose Talks, we've done a half-an-hour event about writers' routines and rituals with Jason Donald. That was just half an hour, and we felt that at the end there were so many questions, and we felt that then actually that could lead to a longer workshop. So having an half-an-hour talk free, but then if you want to sign up for a longer workshop, say a 3-hour workshop, then that would be paid for. Same thing. We did half-an-hour talk with Catherine May. She's just published a book with Ebury, Wintering. Again, that was half-an-hour talk. Catherine is lovely, and she had a lot of questions at the end. Again, that could become a longer workshop, and the idea is to sort of have the longer workshop paid for and the half-an-hour talk free to support the writing community.
Great. And Polly, you've got some similar thoughts there, don't you? What do you see in terms of how we can make this actually a financially sustainable model with these events?
I think one of the things that I look at when I'm thinking about this in terms of forward planning is to look about what has happened elsewhere in terms of media and when the point at which they've gone from free to paid for. So if we look at, say, Spotify, that was free for a while, driven by ad revenue, and then switched to a subscription model. Newspapers, obviously, almost all of them have a premium subscriber model if they're not completely behind a paywall. And now we're seeing it with podcasts, with things like Luminary, where it's a subscriber model that you're moving towards. So the switch from free but with adverts to a paid for option, I think at some point could well come for some virtual events. I think it's going to be interesting to see how and when that happens. I think including in ticket ones is a great idea. I think that at the moment it is experimental, but I think I'm hopeful. I think there's such a massive advantage from a publisher's perspective to virtual events, not least in terms of like costs of shipping people around, but also in terms of that regional breadth that you get from doing a virtual event. I'm really keen. I'm really keen on them overall, but I do think that we're learning very, very quickly about what works and what doesn't. And I think the more we learn over the next couple of weeks and months could well inform what happens next. And I suspect somebody will emerge with a paid for model that works successfully. Just waiting to see who that is.
Brilliant. Anna, quickly before we turn, some delegates from smaller presses have expressed concern that they're struggling to make contact with virtual event organizers. Do you have any suggestions for approaching all of these people who are just cropping up here?
I mean, I think, I think it's interesting, the virtual landscape seems to be slightly reflecting the real world festival setup, which is that it can be harder to get traction with lesser known authors or with, as a smaller press. I mean, I think that has always been the case and possibly always will be. But I think in that situation, you need to basically kind of work out where your fans are. I mean, it's the same as in any situation, that if your author has a well-known, a bigger name who's a big supporter of theirs and might be willing to share them, pitch that to the festival in the same way that you might for a physical festival. Work out what the angle is, and is there a possible panel that you can put together? You need to make it enticing, probably even more so for virtual events than you do with physical, because you can't rely on that passing traffic. But I think it's, as with all things PR related, you need to work out what you can offer and what the person you're speaking to is actually looking for. What is it that's going to entice that festival organizer to click on your email if the name isn't someone that they recognize?
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move a little bit into the kind of marketing calculations and opportunities we're having to make right now. Polly, can you tell us about changes you're making to your campaigns and budgets right now? So how are you reallocating your spend? Is that spend under greater scrutiny? And what are you seeing getting the best traction at the moment?
I think that there are sort of two things that are happening at the moment. There's the initial kind of firefighting. So obviously, as soon as we moved to working from home, and we knew that other people wouldn't be going to offices, we had to look at all our kind of outdoor advertising, whether or not we could move that off. And then we had, so there was that sort of initial thing. A lot of the current marketing activity is primarily online, because obviously that's where everybody is. And we're seeing a huge increase in engagement through our social media ads, through display advertising, and through newsletters as well. Kind of massive 100% increases on all of those in terms of overall engagement, which is really, really encouraging. And I think that's encouraging overall, because I think that there are lessons to be learned about the efficacy of things like outdoor in relation to publishing books anyway. And I think that's quite nice for us to be able to really show what you can do in digital and where you can see the kind of real advantages at the moment. Obviously, that's made more complex by the retail landscape, where you're not sure if your book's going to lose its buy button on Amazon tomorrow and various other issues. But I think that in terms of planning forward, yeah, there's absolutely considerable pressure on our budgets. And I think we are, there are going to be budget cuts across, but marketing budget cuts across the whole industry. And I think it's going to lead to some really tough decisions. However, I think overall, the main thing is just to set aside a slightly higher threshold for your decision making in relation to marketing, so that you are ensuring that everything that you're doing is going to have the required effect. And that may involve more testing early on, so that you're sure that you've got you're leading with the right copy line. It may involve looking at different platforms than you would have done otherwise. But I think it's going to result in some interesting conversations with agents and authors in terms of managing their expectations about what's going to be possible, but also what the right thing is for that book. And I think that I'm hopeful that we might be able to do really interesting things come the autumn that are not necessarily what we would have ordinarily done. But I think it's that taking the opportunity to do something a bit different, because we're slightly being forced into it, is actually it's exciting in some ways. But overall, there is going to be pressure on the budgets for sure.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we take that word opportunity and roll with it a little bit more. Obviously, another or a key opportunity area that we're looking at is digital formats in and audio. So to keep it with you, Polly, on the marketing side, what are you seeing in ebook and audio, and what can you tell us about what's working in terms of marketing in those formats?
We are definitely seeing uplift across our and audio revenue overall. Week on week, it pretty much seems to be keep going up and up. I would say audio market and the e-market seems to be quite distinct. On the e-front, I suspect there are people kind of blowing dust off their Kindles all over the UK at the moment, and that's a really lovely thing for us. I think for those particular types of people, and this is what we're seeing overall, is that what they're leaning towards are the tried and trusted brands. So, and this is across children's and adults. So for example, we're having really good cut through on things like Philippa Gregory and Dork Diaries on the children's side. So things that where people already have an awareness of it, we can kind of bed down into those kind of safe brands. If you think that there's, in times of recession, I think what people do is they are more cautious about their spending. So they're not going to take a risk. And I think that that's what we have to kind of have in the back of our mind, is that making it really clear to the consumer that this is a safe purchase for them, particularly those people who may be picking up the Kindle that they haven't been using for a little while, which I suspect, looking at our numbers, is probably what's going on. On the audio front, it is quite distinct, because I think, I don't know if anybody else finds this, but I think with our audio numbers, it's definitely driven by specific channels. I think it's shifted slightly because obviously people are not commuting. So I think some of the books which maybe were kind of regular purchases by professionals in London, the business titles perhaps aren't doing the sorts of numbers that they were doing before, but then there are other titles. We've got a YouTuber, for example, who's massively increased her content during lockdown, and her numbers are flying. So I think that's quite kind of voice specific. Whereas I would say tried and tested brands doing well at the moment.
Okay, great. So we're going to come to Laura in a second, because she's got more on the children's front there. But first, let me go to Anna, just on publicity. Digital formats are obviously really hard, notoriously, to PR. So are you seeing anything that's working in that space?
I mean, I think from my perspective, it feels like the key with both ebook and with audio is just to make sure that from the very, very start of any campaign, you're taking them into account. And I think that's probably the case before, this slightly weird situation that we find ourselves in now, and is even more important now. So making sure that, those formats are flagged up very, very clearly, making sure that when you're looking at possible social media content, you look at audio clips, you look at, those possible options, and you make sure that you're communicating with the narrators, particularly if they're bigger names, that you're really kind of flagging those up to their fans as well as to fans of Readers in Total. I think it's interesting, our audio list bestsellers are almost all perennial bestsellers, they're all classics, which is quite unusual for our list in general. So I think that kind of what Polly was saying just now chimes in my experience as well. And I think, you know, as we touched on earlier, there is this silver lining of the fact that more journalists are beginning to read digitally. I think it could be interesting to see how long that continues, but this is a wonderful opportunity for us in many ways. And I think we just need to kind of run with it.
All right, great. So Laura, you were obviously at HarperCollins Children's during the 2008 crisis. What did you take from that period, following on from Polly's remarks, in terms of where we should be focusing our efforts right now in terms of children's marketing?
Absolutely. I think what Polly's mentioned in terms of evergreen classics, really something that I saw in 2008. So at HarperCollins in 2008, we saw a decrease in sales of licensed properties based on new TV series, whilst we saw an increase of evergreen classics like Mog, Tiger Came to Tea, and contemporary classics like Oliver Jeffers. So we saw that parents were still spending even at time of a crisis, but they were investing on evergreen trusted brands. So I think what Polly and Anna said, making sure that parents know that this is a trusted brand, something they can rely on, in particular at time of a crisis, is really, really important. And I think in terms of sort of opportunities for children, I feel that children are starting to engage with screens also in a different way. And I can make the example of what happened in Italy, for example, where the lockdown started a bit earlier. Schools started to use Zoom and Google Hangout to deliver classes. And we've seen that happening now in the UK, also with the Department of Education now saying that over 180 lessons will be available every week. So screens are not just entertainment for children, they just start to get adjusted to them also as a sort of educational, for educational purposes. And we touched on audiobooks. Audiobooks is, of course, become such a fantastic opportunity also for children, with Audible also providing free audiobooks for them at this time in 6 different languages. So I think different screens and using different platforms, and at the same time trusted brand for children are the opportunities really.
Okay, brilliant. We're getting pretty close to our time for audience questions. I'm just going to ask you guys a couple more questions. First to Polly and Anna. Obviously, bookshops are showing just a phenomenal level of innovation and creativity right now, but they definitely need our support. So what can we do? Just give me 1 or 2 to support bookshops right now. Why don't we start with Polly?
I think about the autumn for those bookshops and think about the ways that we can help them in the autumn, perhaps prioritizing them over other places in ways that are going to really help their bottom line. So I think if we can throw some big events towards those indie bookshops in the autumn, I think you'd be doing them a massive favor, because I think it's easy to forget how much those sorts of, you know, one event can make a massive difference to an independent bookshop. So I would, but also they're going to have the time to plan it in advance. So that's what I would do right now.
Anna, how about you?
To a degree, I think almost kind of ask the booksellers what they need. I think, you know, so many of them at the moment, you know, say that what they really want is sales incentives or discounts. You know, we're doing a lot in terms of signed copies and offering book plates, offering personalized books for some of their customers. It feels like a really small but easy thing to do, to post a set of book plates to an author and have them, you know, literally personalize the books for a particular bookshop's customer. You know, particularly if your author has a local bookshop they love, then ask them if they'd be willing to support that shop in particular, and just amplify. You know, we often have, as publishers, much bigger social media accounts than an independent bookshop will by themselves. And so remind your followers that they're out there, they need your support, and just because their shop, you know, just because their doors aren't open doesn't mean they're not selling and they're not working. I think it's just, yeah, amplification.
I think just that really chimes with what came out of the Independent Booksellers Forum last week, which is that they were really requesting that authors record videos of themselves asking their followers to go to independent bookshops, to put those out on their channels, on publisher channels, and that things like signed stock and any sort of point of difference are massive right now. So I'm not, as we kind of get close to question time, I don't want to ask anyone for predictions, because why? But I would like to ask, from what we've seen so far, what is one thing that you'd like to see change in publishing as a result of this crisis when we get sort of back to normal? Laura, why don't we start with you?
I think rely more on smart working. I mean, believing that smart working and being, flexibility can be a way forward. And I think that sort of chimes with what Polly mentioned at the beginning. Is not something that should just happen in a time of crisis. And I think from a sort of consumer marketing perspective, keep building communities and not rely on vanity metrics, because very often you might have 1,000 of views on an Instagram live, but actually, having a Zoom chat with 100 people can be much more valuable because you're really building a community there. Smart working and community.
Great. Anna, how about you?
I think I'd love publishing to take a lesson away about accessibility. I think we're an industry which I think prides ourselves on being inclusive in some, various different forms. I think, the individuals that tend to work in publishing tend to pride ourselves as individuals on being inclusive, open-minded people. I think we can often forget about that when it's inconvenient. And as I mentioned earlier about events, I think, touches again on the idea of working from home and flexible working hours and all those kind of things. I think we are beginning to get a very real sense of what is possible. And obviously that's not always going to be ideal. It's not always going to be possible from a logistical perspective, but I'd love to see us making a really conscious effort to try and become more inclusive as an industry, both the people working in it and the people who want to read our books and attend our events.
Okay, Polly, how about you?
I suspect through the next couple of months, I think there's going to be a renewed appreciation for marketers and publicists across the business, as obviously some people get furloughed. There's going to be increased pressures on people, and I think the things that people have achieved over the last couple of weeks have been phenomenal, and I think that people have such creativity and efficiency in really, really trying circumstances. So I think that appreciation should stay. One of the other things I feel as well is that there's been a real team spirit across publishing, and I would really like us to hold on to that notion. I think that how working from home gives us a very human insight into our colleagues, and also to kind of third-party stakeholders, whoever it is that we're dealing with it, whether it's retailers, bookshops, agents, etc. And I think that kind of insight into people's lives is a really healthy thing overall.
Agreed. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go into question time now. First question is for Polly. You said, no pressure, you said you're quickly finding out what works and what doesn't work for events online. Can you share a couple pitfalls to avoid?
I think the thing that Laura talked about earlier about getting questions in advance is a really good one, because I think what that means is then you're less relying on the author knowing how to give the audience what they want, because you don't get that feedback that you have when somebody's on stage and they can hear people laughing at certain points or whatever. I think sometimes authors can feel a little bit sort of deer in the headlights. So I think if there is an opportunity to call out for questions in advance, you're also then helping out the authors who are perhaps slightly less technical and don't like things kind of coming at them during the process of the event going on. So I would say that's a really, I think that's a really sensible approach to take.
Great. And actually, I think if Anna or Laura have any other things on pitfalls, Laura, you've touched on some. Anna, did you have anything to add? You're nodding, or?
No, I mean, I think that's about right. I think also just kind of being as clear as possible with the author before they step on stage, as it were. I think in exactly as you're saying, Polly, that this is new ground for all of us, and it can be fairly intimidating, I think, for authors, as you say, not to have that audience feedback. And, particularly for people who aren't necessarily that tech savvy. And I think just being as upfront as possible, doing test runs if you can, making sure that they know what to expect, as it happens, I think is exactly right.
Great. Let's have, let's say Laura first and then Polly. There's a question around, has anyone tried TikTok for marketing books in this environment, and is it working? Laura, do you want to start?
I think TikTok, of course, is a very, very clear audience. So, if you've if you're targeting the sort of the 13 plus, then of course there is an opportunity there. Creating video. I haven't personally used it, but I think there is an opportunity there. In particular, in lockdown, people are using the platform even more. But it's a very, very specific audience. It's like your teenage audience, and I wouldn't use it for a slightly older audience. Polly, Anna, have you used it for your campaigns?
We haven't used it beyond some of our authors having their own channels there. So at the moment, no. We looked into it last year, but at that point, the marketing functionality there wasn't kind of up and running. So, and we haven't actually looked at it since. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. It's a really delicate space, I think, TikTok. We have to be very, very careful because there's a lot of sinister goings on TikTok, let's say it like that. So I think you do have to be more cautious than ever in dealing with that particular platform. But I think it's obviously had a massive boost in the last couple of weeks. And it's been growing since, for over a year. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting space. Great.
Thank you. There's a request from the floor for some specificity, and it's hard to get at this stage at the game, but obviously everything's really new. Anna or Polly, have you had any time to do any proper analysis on any of the campaigns that you've been running during this period that shows really specifically X is working, Y is not? Why don't we start with you, Polly?
I would say the main thing that we've seen so far is that reliance on tried and tested brands. So I'll try and be as specific as I can about what we did as soon as we went into lockdown. So I had a look at what stock various online stores had of our books, knowing that we may have some troubles in delivering new stock. So I took a look at what our stock was, I looked at what our budget was, and then cross-checked those two things, and we did some experimental kind of backlist marketing and kind of some kind of key front list titles as well, testing out new things. And I would say of all the ones we did, anything which was a debut was much more difficult to get cut through. Anything which was a brand was much more immediate in terms of the conversion to sale. Your engagement on the debut may well be just as high, but the cut through on the sale was much stronger on the brands, the tried and trusted brands, particularly things where they had really good reviews on Amazon already, lots of press reviews already in the bank. So I would say in terms of an investment, that from a marketing perspective, that was where we've had really good cut through over the last couple of weeks. Looking forward, not many books are being published in June, so there is an advantage to pitching to the press for books in June, because I think there are a lot of journalists with some holes on their pages. So I think if you've got June books, you could probably get some things that you wouldn't ordinarily get.
Great. Anna, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think that's pretty much covered it. I would say that May and June, from my perspective, seems to be the place where the gaps are falling, and certainly the journalists I'm speaking to on the literary side are getting a little bit worried about it. So absolutely, there's some opportunities there. We've moved quite a lot of our books into the autumn or even back to 2021. The ones that we've kept tend to be either more established brands or books that we think, have a particular resonance at the moment, whether it's because it's something to do with kind of nature writing and that sort of connection to nature that I think a lot of people are rediscovering at the moment, or a little bit of armchair travel, or pop psychology to a certain degree, but it's things that has a kind of a link into the news that we've kept, as well as the bigger brands.
Great, thank you. And Laura, are you seeing any particular, in terms of your digital marketing that you're doing, are you seeing anything particularly, any particularly effective content, any particularly effective channel that you're throwing everything at, or is it really dependent on the titles?
I think it's really dependent on the titles and sort of the demographics. We've seen an increase in a click-through rate for Facebook, but of course it's become an increasingly saturated platform, and that's sort of for the slightly older demographic, the 45 plus, and of course Instagram and Zoom has worked for virtual book launches and events I've mentioned. So it really depends on the type of book and the demographic you're sort of targeting.
Okay. Then we've got, I think probably time for one more question from the floor, and then I'll bring it back around, which is for anyone who's open to it. How do you deal with the uncertainty around furloughing, and how can those of us on furlough keep up to date with what's happening in the industry? Anna, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it comes back to the same thing I've been saying the whole way through, which is communication. And, you know, obviously while you're on furlough, you're not allowed to work for your company, but that doesn't mean that you can't be in touch with people you know at the company if you choose to do so, you know, to keep up with company gossip, or, you know, kind of follow on social media or whatever it happens to be. I think it will be, everyone will have a different way of dealing with it. I think some people will want to cut themselves off completely and almost take it as holiday and, you know, sort of go out for walks and live their lives and not really think about it. I think other people will find it really hard to do that and would much prefer to sort of keep in on exactly what's going on. Hopefully your manager should be in touch with you and let you know as things progress as to whether it's likely the furlough will be extended or whether it will kind of end after 3 weeks. But again, I think it has to be dealt with on an individual and a company basis.
Polly, do you have anything to add on that one?
On that one, I think there are real communication issues with both furlough and people who are currently still at work. And I think one of the things you lose is the kind of casual information that people get. So you have to work extra hard as a team leader to ensure that people are hearing all the things that they should be hearing, that they might just hear a kind of on the off chance in the office. So you have to work extra hard to ensure that information is flowing through to people in the right way. In terms of furloughing kind of more generally and keeping up, obviously Twitter, there's lots of information going on there. I would highly recommend the Bookseller for keeping up to date with the latest news in the book selling trade. And other sites are available. So yeah, I would definitely keep an eye on the trade press if you feel comfortable doing that, and if you find it helpful. You do have to be careful that you're not doing any activity that thanks Nigel, that is driving revenue. That's the issue with furloughing, is that you cannot do anything which is making money for your company, and hopefully your HR people and your bosses have had that conversation with you. So I think that you need to have that conversation, make sure you know what guidelines are, what you can and can't do. But I'm sure that you can read some brilliant upcoming books.
Absolutely. All right, I've got one final question from me to all of you before we wrap up, which is just, how will you define what success looks like at the end of this year? Laura, let's start with you.
I think if I've managed to offer support and value to our authors and our readers, I think I've done my job. I think right now, and I know it's really hard because as a marketer, of course, our sales are really important, but right now it's not just about monetization, it's about brand building and making sure that we're providing support.
Thank you. Anna, how about you?
I think I would say that I'll feel like we've been successful this year if our authors and the team that work at Canongate feel just as proud to be a part of Canongate at the end of the year as they did at the start. You know, that they feel just as confident that Canongate is a publishing house that cares about the books and the authors that we publish, and that we'll publish them in a creative and effective way no matter how challenging the circumstances.
Beautiful. Thank you. Polly, how about you?
I would agree. I think first and foremost, a happy and healthy family and team will be a win. But then that same thing about our authors and the agents that can see that we have worked our socks off to do our very, very best in really challenging circumstances.
That's a great note to end on. All that's left for me is to thank you all so much for coming, and to thank our panelists, Polly, Anna, and Laura. Everyone who's attended, you'll all be receiving an email tomorrow with some bullet points compiled by the BMS and the PPC, plus a video of this recording, which you can watch over and over and over again, and of course share with anyone who couldn't make it today. You can expect the next event from us within a matter of weeks, and we will announce that here soon. Please do get in touch with me or with the Bookseller to share your thoughts about today's event and what you would like to see next. Thank you again to our lovely panelists, and thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.